Munich, May 1945. The war in Europe is over, but in the American occupation zone of Bavaria, the work of accounting has just begun. Counterintelligence Corps detachment units move through cities and towns, compiling lists, checking identity papers, conducting interrogations. Former Wehrmacht officers report to processing centers. SS personnel are detained automatically. Civilians queue for hours to receive ration cards and work permits. The bureaucracy of occupation is replacing the bureaucracy of the Reich. In a converted hotel in Munich city center, American officers process hundreds of German military personnel daily. They check names against master lists compiled from captured documents. They cross-reference unit assignments, ask about wartime activities, note suspicious gaps in service records. Most are cleared after routine questioning. Some are detained for further investigation. A few are immediately transferred to war crimes authorities. On May 18, 1945, Oberstleutnant Heinrich Kellermann reports to the processing center as required by occupation regulations. Born 1908 in Stuttgart, career Wehrmacht officer. Signals intelligence, attached to WWII, the Armed Forces High Command Cipher Bureau. His military identification book shows continuous service from 1935 through April 1945, postings to Berlin, Warsaw, and finally back to Berlin in 1943. Standard documentation for a technical specialist. Nothing unusual. The American officer conducting the interview asks routine questions. Unit assignments. Duties. Knowledge of war crimes. Kellermann answers precisely, calmly, providing dates and technical details about signals operations without offering anything beyond what was asked. His file is noted technical personnel, no combat role, clear for release pending denazification processing. He is photographed, fingerprinted, and issued temporary papers allowing him to remain in Munich. The interview lasts 20 minutes. He is one of 47 officers processed that day. And then something remarkable happens. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Kellermann, a signals intelligence officer who should have been subjected to extensive interrogation about German cryptographic systems, who should have been of intense interest to Allied intelligence services desperate to understand Axis communication security, simply walks away. No detention. No transfer to specialized interrogation facilities. No flag in his file indicating intelligence value. Just routine processing and release. Within weeks, his name would appear on no arrest lists, no wanted bulletins, no requests for information from Allied intelligence agencies. For a man with his background and expertise, the silence was extraordinary and would last for 80 years. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. Heinrich Kellermann's wartime assignment placed him at the heart of German signals intelligence operations. WWII managed Wehrmacht communication security, developed and distributed cipher systems, monitored radio traffic, and coordinated with other German intelligence agencies on cryptographic matters. It was technical work requiring advanced mathematics, linguistic ability, and absolute discretion. The kind of work that made officers like Kellermann invaluable to the war effort and, later, to the intelligence services that defeated them. His personnel file, discovered decades later in fragmentary Wehrmacht archives, shows steady advancement through the signals intelligence bureaucracy. Junior officer in 1935. Assignment to cipher development in 1938. Promoted to staff officer in 1940. By 1943, he was working in the Central Berlin facility, producing technical assessments of Allied cryptanalytic capabilities and recommending security improvements for German communication systems. A fitness report from December 1943, preserved in captured documents, describe him as exceptionally capable in technical matters, thorough in analysis, politically reliable though not ideologically motivated. The phrase, politically reliable though not ideologically motivated, appeared frequently in evaluations of technical specialists whose value lay in expertise rather than party loyalty, men who served the Reich without necessarily believing in its ideology. In early 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west, Kellermann remained in Berlin, coordinating the evacuation and destruction of sensitive materials. Wehrmacht Signals Intelligence records show his signature on documents authorizing the transfer of cipher equipment and the destruction of operational files in March and April 1945. On April 22, 1945, with Soviet forces entering Berlin's outskirts, Kellerman was among personnel evacuated south toward Bavaria. A transport manifest lists him departing Berlin on a military convoy heading toward what remained of the southern defensive zone. The manifest shows departure but no arrival destination, routine for the chaos of late April 1945. His next documented appearance was May 18th at the American Processing Center in Munich. The gap between April 22nd and May 18th was 26 days. Where he spent that time, how he traveled from Berlin to Munich through Germany in its final collapse, what happened to materials he may have been carrying. None of that was recorded in Allied documents or his own testimony during the brief processing interview. When American forces compiled lists of Wehrmacht Signals Intelligence personnel for potential interrogation about German cryptographic systems, Kellerman's name appeared on preliminary rosters. He was flagged as having held a position that would have given him detailed knowledge of Wehrmacht cipher procedures, security protocols, and organizational structures. Men in his position were exactly the kind of technical specialists the Allies wanted to interrogate systematically. But he was never interrogated. No technical debriefing. No request for information about German communication security. No transfer to specialized facilities where captured signals personnel were being systematically questioned about Axis cryptographic methods and vulnerabilities. In September 1945, British intelligence, conducting their own assessment of captured German signals personnel, requested information about Kellerman from American occupation authorities. They wanted to interview him about his knowledge of German-British communication security interactions, about what the Wehrmacht had known regarding Allied cryptanalysis, about potential compromises of British cipher systems. The American response, delivered through military government channels, stated simply, Subject Heinrich Kellerman, former Wehrmacht Signals Intelligence, released through denazification process June 1945. Current whereabouts unknown. No record of intelligence debriefing. Released in June. For weeks after his initial processing. No interrogation. No exploitation of his technical knowledge. Just routine denazification and release. The British filed a follow-up inquiry, noting the unusual nature of releasing a senior signals intelligence officer without technical debriefing. The response, when it came weeks later, stated only that the subject had been processed according to standard procedures and no additional information was available. In 1947, the U.S. Army Security Agency, responsible for signals intelligence and cryptanalysis, compiled a comprehensive study of German wartime cryptographic systems. The study relied heavily on interrogations of captured Wehrmacht signals personnel, on seized equipment, on captured documents. Dozens of former German cipher specialists were interviewed over months, their knowledge systematically extracted and documented in technical reports that would inform American cryptographic development for years. Kellerman's name appeared in the study's bibliography as a reference, someone whose position suggested he should have been interviewed. But there was no interrogation transcript, no technical report, no indication that he had ever been questioned about his wartime work. A researcher working on the study submitted an inquiry about why Kellerman had not been interviewed given his apparent expertise and position. The response, preserved in project files declassified in 1995, stated, Subject Kellerman handled through separate channel. No additional information available. Separate channel. The phrase suggested something beyond routine intelligence debriefing, some process or arrangement that existed outside the standard procedures for exploiting captured enemy expertise. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Kellerman lived quietly in Stuttgart, working as an electrical engineer for a telecommunications company. He appeared in city directories, in professional association memberships, in routine administrative records. A normal civilian life, unremarkable and undisturbed by questions about his wartime service or his unusually smooth transition from Wehrmacht signals intelligence to civilian engineering. In 1963, the West German government, conducting background checks on citizens working in sensitive technical fields with potential security implications, reviewed Kellerman's wartime service. His work in Wehrmacht signals intelligence was noted as a matter of record, but his denazification clearance from 1945 was accepted without question. No additional investigation was conducted. No red flags were raised about the gap between his technical expertise and the absence of any Allied interrogation records. In 1972, a doctoral student researching German signals intelligence during World War II encountered Kellermann's name in organizational charts of WWII. The student requested an interview through standard academic channels, hoping to document the experiences of surviving signals intelligence personnel. Kellermann declined politely, citing advanced age and poor health. He died 2 years later in 1974, his obituary noting his career as an engineer in his service as a Wehrmacht signals officer during the war. No mention of his specific assignment or the technical nature of his wartime work. Historians researching German cryptography occasionally encountered his name in captured documents, always in technical contexts, always in positions that suggested significant knowledge of German communication security. But there were no interrogation records, no post-war debriefings, no indication that Allied intelligence had ever exploited his expertise despite the systematic exploitation of dozens of his colleagues. The absence was strange. The Allies had been methodical about interrogating German signals intelligence personnel, about documenting their knowledge, about using that expertise to inform post-war cryptographic development. Men with far less significant positions than Kellermann had been interrogated extensively, their knowledge carefully extracted and preserved in technical reports. But Kellermann had walked away in June 1945 and simply returned civilian life, untouched by the intelligence exploitation that consumed so many of his former colleagues. The silence around his case wasn't random. It was too complete, too consistent across too many agencies and archives. Files that should have existed didn't. Records that should have documented his interrogation were absent, and the one phrase that appeared in the 1947 inquiry, handled through separate channel, suggested something beyond standard procedures, something that required deliberate management across institutional boundaries. Dr. Thomas Schneider was researching Allied exploitation of German signals intelligence after World War II, focusing on how captured enemy cryptographic expertise informed the development of American and British communication security during the early Cold War. A historian at the Technical University of Munich, Schneider had spent years working through declassified NSA and GCHQ documents, trying to understand the transfer of knowledge from defeated enemy to victorious powers. In 2023, while reviewing recently released CIA files from the late 1940s, part of a routine declassification cycle, he found something unexpected. It was an internal memo from 1948 discussing the security classification of former enemy signals intelligence personnel currently or previously employed in technical advisory capacity. The memo listed several criteria for maintaining classification: ongoing operational value, potential diplomatic complications with former allies who might object to employment of enemy personnel, protection of cryptographic sources and methods, standard bureaucratic language for sensitive programs. Attached was a roster of case file reference numbers. Most were completely redacted, but one entry was partially visible, the ink having faded slightly over decades. Case 45 Cipher. Subject: H. Kellermann, former WWII. Status: employed 1945 to 1947. Classification: protected. Current status: release of civilian life per agreement. Continued monitoring: affirmative. The memo was dated in 1948, 3 years after the war. It confirmed that Kellermann hadn't just been released without interrogation. He had been employed by American intelligence for 2 years, then released under some kind of agreement that required continued monitoring. Schneider requested the full cipher case file through Freedom of Information Act channels. The response came months later. Requested materials remain classified under National Security Exemption 50 U.S.C. 3024I. Cryptographic sources and methods. Access denied. He tried a different approach. If Kellermann had been employed in a technical capacity, there might be references in budget documents, project files, organizational charts that mention him indirectly without triggering the same classification protections. He found fragments scattered across multiple archives. In a 1946 Army Security Agency budget document, partially declassified in 2015, there was a line item for Technical Advisors, German Cryptographic Systems, with notation, continuation of cipher arrangement, specialized knowledge Wehrmacht cipher procedures, annual cost $12,000. In a 1947 NSA predecessor organization memo discussing transition from military to civilian control of signals intelligence operations, there was a paragraph about contractor personnel with specialized technical knowledge being transitioned to civilian status per original employment agreements, security obligations maintained. None of these documents name Kellerman explicitly, but the case number, the specialty, the timeline, and the amounts all aligned. He had been employed immediately after the war, worked for 2 years on American cryptographic projects, then been released to civilian life under an agreement that required his continued silence and allowed monitoring of his activities. The breakthrough came from British archives. In 2024, GCHQ released a batch of files from the immediate post-war period, materials that had been held under extended classification due to their cryptographic sensitivity. Among them was a 1946 memo from British Signals Intelligence to their American counterparts discussing coordination regarding employment of former enemy cryptographic personnel. One paragraph read, regarding cipher, Heinrich Kellerman, former OKW Chiffrebetrieb, British services concur with American arrangement for technical employment. Subject provided valuable information during May 1945 initial debriefing regarding German knowledge of Allied cipher security, Wehrmacht assessments of Soviet cryptographic capabilities, and technical details of Axis communication systems. Recommend continued employment for duration of technical projects and subsequent release under Standard Protection Agreement. No prosecution, recommended given cooperation and technical value. May 1945 initial debriefing. The 26 days between his departure from Berlin and his appearance at the Munich Processing Center. He hadn't spent that time fleeing or hiding. He had been in American custody somewhere, providing technical debriefing on German cryptographic knowledge, establishing his value, negotiating the terms of his protection. When he appeared at the Munich Processing Center on May 18th, the interview wasn't a screening. It was theater. The American officer asking routine questions already knew who Kellerman was, what he had been doing, what arrangement had been made. The brief processing and release were the public face of a decision already made in secret, a performance of the administrative record, while the real arrangement remained classified. Schneider found confirmation in an unlikely source. A Soviet intelligence report obtained by Western services during the Cold War and partially declassified in 2020, discussed German signals intelligence officers who had provided cooperation to Western allies in exchange for protection from prosecution. One entry mentioned Wehrmacht cipher specialist, Berlin headquarters, provided technical debriefing to American services May 1945, employed in technical capacity 1945 to 1947, released a civilian life per protection agreement. Subjects' cooperation included information regarding Wehrmacht knowledge of Soviet cipher systems and German assessment of Allied cryptanalytic success against Axis communications. The report was based on information the Soviets had obtained through penetration of Western intelligence services or through their own network of informants in occupied Germany. It confirmed what the Western document suggested but didn't explicitly state. Kellerman had provided valuable intelligence not just about German systems, but about what the Germans had known regarding Allied capabilities, including Soviet capabilities. That knowledge made him valuable in the emerging Cold War. But crucial questions remained unanswered, protected by classification barriers that showed no sign of coming down. What specific information had he provided? Had he approached the Americans during the chaotic final weeks? Or had they identified him from captured documents and sought him out? What had he done to secure protection? What had he given them that was worth forgiving whatever role he had played in the Wehrmacht signals intelligence apparatus? Schneider filed requests for additional declassification with NSA, CIA, and the National Archives. The responses stated that materials related to cipher operation remain classified under cryptographic sources and methods exemptions, that the information was still considered sensitive to current operations, that no release was authorized at this time. He found one final document in a 2022 NSA release of historical materials. It was a 1974 memo written shortly after Kellerman's death, discussing the status of long-term monitoring arrangements for former enemy technical personnel employed during early Cold War period. The memo noted, Cipher, Heinrich Kellerman, deceased 1974. Monitoring arrangement terminated. Subject maintained agreement terms throughout civilian life. Made no unauthorized disclosures regarding wartime cooperation or post-war employment. All materials related to subject's technical contributions to U.S. cryptographic development remain classified per 1947 security determination. Recommend continued classification given sensitivity of information provided regarding Allied cipher security vulnerabilities known to enemy during wartime. Allied cipher security vulnerabilities. Kellerman's value hadn't just been in explaining German systems. It had been in revealing what the Germans had known about Allied systems, what they had successfully broken or compromised, what weaknesses they had identified. That information was sensitive not because it revealed German capabilities, but because it revealed Allied failures during the war. And that information remained classified 80 years later, protected not by operational necessity, but by institutional reluctance to acknowledge how much the enemy had known, how vulnerable Allied communications had been, how much had been compromised. The truth about Heinrich Kellerman is no longer completely hidden. It exists in fragmentary declassified documents, in cross-references across multiple archives, in the gaps where records should be but aren't. He was a Wehrmacht signals intelligence officer who provided cooperation to American services in May 1945. He was employed for 2 years working on U.S. cryptographic projects. He was released to civilian life under a protection agreement that guaranteed his silence and his immunity from prosecution. He lived quietly in Stuttgart until his death in 1974, never speaking about his wartime work or his post-war employment. But the full story remained sealed behind classification barriers maintained by institutions that decided what he knew was worth more than accountability for what he'd done. The documents that would answer the essential questions. What specific information did he provide? What Allied cipher systems had the Germans compromised? What vulnerabilities had he revealed? What role had he played in Wehrmacht operations that might have warranted prosecution? Those documents remain classified at Fort Meade, in NSA's historical archives. In 2024, a retired NSA cryptographer, speaking anonymously to a journalist researching Cold War intelligence operations, said something revealing. The Kellerman case is typical of a pattern from that period. We needed to know what they knew. We needed to understand how much of our communications had been compromised during the war. And the only people who could tell us that were the enemy cryptographers who'd been reading our traffic. So we made deals. We gave them immunity, employed them, and classified everything they told us because admitting what they'd learned meant admitting our failures. 80 years later, we're still protecting those secrets, not because they're operationally sensitive, but because institutions don't like acknowledging they were vulnerable. Schneider's research revealed something beyond Kellerman's individual story. In the declassified documents, he found references to similar case files: cipher, decode, signal, frequency. Each was described as former enemy signals intelligence personnel, employed in technical capacity, released under protection agreement. Each file remained classified. Each subject's specific contributions remained protected. Each case suggested a systematic program of identifying, employing, and protecting enemy cryptographers in exchange for information about what they had learned regarding Allied communication security during the war. Schneider filed requests for information about the other case files. The responses stated that materials related to post-World War II employment of enemy cryptographic personnel remained classified under long-standing security agreements, that the information revealed vulnerabilities in historical Allied communication systems that remained sensitive for reasons that could not be disclosed, that no declassification was authorized. In late 2024, Schneider received an anonymous message through an encrypted email service. The message was brief: "You found Cipher. Ask why he was never prosecuted when others with similar positions were. Ask what he gave them that was worth complete immunity. Ask what Allied systems the Germans had broken that we still don't want anyone to know about. The classification isn't protecting cryptographic methods. It's protecting reputation. They're not coming out. 80 years after Heinrich Kellermann walked into an American processing center in Munich and walked out a free man, his story is partially known. He was a Wehrmacht signals intelligence officer who cooperated with American services in May 1945. He was employed for 2 years on cryptographic projects. He was released under a protection agreement. He lived quietly in Stuttgart until his death in 1974, never revealing what he knew, what he'd done, what he'd been protected from. But the full truth remains locked behind classification barriers maintained by institutions that decided his knowledge was more valuable than justice, that what he could reveal about Allied failures was too sensitive to ever acknowledge publicly. The files exist. They sit in archives at Fort Meade, in storage facilities that house NSA's historical records, marked with classifications that have never expired, protected by decisions made 80 years ago about what truths were too damaging to reveal. Because Heinrich Kellermann's story isn't just about one man's immunity from prosecution. It's about a system that prioritized intelligence advantage over accountability, that protected former enemies who could reveal inconvenient truths about Allied vulnerabilities, that sealed those revelations behind classification barriers that may never fall. And whether we'll ever know what Allied communication systems were compromised during the war, what intelligence was lost, what operations were betrayed by communications the enemy was reading, or whether those failures will remain classified forever, protected not by security concerns but by institutional pride. The streets of Stuttgart are quiet now, the post-war reconstruction long complete, the scars of war invisible beneath decades of peace and prosperity. No marker indicates where Kellermann lived, where he worked at the telecommunications company, where he carried his secrets to his grave. History records the cryptographic victories, the codes broken by Allied intelligence, the intelligence gathered through signals exploitation. But the failures, the systems compromised, the vulnerabilities exploited by the enemy, the truths too embarrassing to acknowledge, those remain hidden behind classifications that outlived everyone involved. Heinrich Kellermann was never arrested after World War II. 80 years later, we learned why, but only part why. Only the outline of the bargain that was struck, the knowledge that was traded for immunity, the secrets that were sealed to protect not operations, but reputations. And maybe that's all we were ever meant to know. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.